Syria, you can pick up from here.
Okay. All right, great. David, I am excited, much as I was to not be your moderator today, but I found myself here and I'm excited because I see you're a fellow of the CIPD. I'm an associate member, so I'm very excited to get the chance to host you. I think I will let you do an introduction. Tell us a bit about yourself before then we go into the discussion.
Thank you, Syria. Yes, indeed, I am a fellow of the CIPD, and I've been in HR all my life. I specialize in learning and development. The first half of my career, I worked in large corporations like British Telecom, the UK's National Health Service, and big financial services companies. And I was a management consultant, and I've worked on 6 different continents. The second half of my career, I worked in universities, carrying on to be an HR consultant around the world, doing presentations like this. And I also worked with many managers, helping them to get their master's degree, as well as membership of the CIPD. About 5 years ago, I went on a workshop on HR analytics. And I thought, this is fantastic, actually bringing HR and analytics together, maybe for the first time. Unfortunately, the time wasn't right. And so we've moved on from there. And so that now what we're able to do is to address the needs of HR through a brand new international.
Right, excellent. That's very exciting to hear for me because my CAPD is in learning and development. So I'm like, wow, I was actually meant to be hosting this session.
Well, if you cut me there, it says learning, and if you cut me there, it says development.
That is so awesome. My sweet spot. I think then we can jump right in. Maybe my first question would be, when you got into the analytics bit, did you focus on just learning and analytics, or did you drop learning altogether and got into HR analytics?
That's a good question. I've been around the whole area of the evaluation and validation of L&D for many, many years. Many of our participants here will have heard of the Kirkpatrick model, and after that came Jack Phillips and his model on ROI. And but in fact, there was one many, many years ago, Jack Fitzens, who talked about the ROI of HR. Another worker in this field is who has been working for many, many years, is Dick Swanson, who's come up with some fantastic models and examples of how to actually measure the return on L&D. So that's where I started, obviously. However, the ROI of HR has been something that has been very, very difficult until very recently. And whilst there have been many analytical aspects to human capital management platforms, whether they're the big platforms done by the big vendors or smaller platforms, most of these have been quantitative rather than qualitative. So obviously I started with L&D and then branched into HRM.
Excellent, excellent. So maybe tell us a story around ROI, because for sure it's been a challenge for me in my role. I'm sure anybody who's in the audience, it has been a real challenge for an L&D practitioner, for the HR team to go out into business and either get them to go for a program or change the way we do things because we're not able to see or measure the ROI. Perhaps take us through the story of then where did we begin in terms of measuring HR programs, measuring HR activities, up to where we are now that we're saying, okay, we have something that can actually measure HR activities.
Thank you, Syria. Yes, indeed, you're absolutely right. It has been an uphill battle. And one of the things that I want to do is to change the whole of the function of HR away from being a service function and a transactional function and shift it towards being transformational. And one of the things that this new international standard ISO 30414 will do is to make sure that HR can now sit in the boardroom with the other directors and the chief exec. Until fairly recently, HR, we're very professional, we know our job, but to be honest, we haven't talked the same language as the people in the C-suite, the boardroom, because they're talking about graphs and charts and numbers and spreadsheets. And to be frank, HR hasn't really been confident in using that kind of language. For example, I was talking to a chief exec recently, and he liked the idea of analytics and data and evidence. He liked the idea of the international standard, but he said, we can't do it. It's not in the budget. And I said, well, of course it's not in the budget. You haven't planned for it. But next year it will be in the budget because you will have planned for it. He said, oh, well, we can't afford it. I said, well, with greatest respect, you can, because you're wasting money. And he took offense at that. He said, what do you mean? I said, okay, have you had a middle manager leave your organization in the last few months? He said, yes, of course. And I said, and you miss them, what they contributed to the organization and your bottom line? Yes, he said. And I said, okay, how much will it cost you to replace that person? And he said, I don't know. And he looked at his HR director and said, how much will it cost to replace that man? And she said, I've been telling you, it's about 75% of payroll. And he couldn't believe it. And I said, okay, would you like to reduce your labor turnover by 1 percentage point? He said, can you do that? I said, no, but your HR director can, and I'm here to help her do her job. You see, going forward around the world, there's going to be massive differences, massive changes because of the COVID-19. Every organization will change. Many organizations are embracing a remote working in a way that they never did before, because in the past, the supervisor or the manager would say, if I can't see you, I can't trust you. Whereas they're finding now people working remotely, they're taking accountability and responsibility for their work, and productivity is actually going up. But the other big change is that every organization will now have to grasp the nettle of what it's doing. What's its purpose? Many will be diversifying into new markets and new products. Many will be downsizing. There will be mergers and acquisitions. There may be offshoring or outsourcing. Every organization is going to have to change. And the way to solve the big problems concerning change, there's two solutions. Firstly, technology, and secondly, human resources. And what we're doing is bringing those two together so that the future of organizations will embrace technology and HR as never before. Perhaps while you're thinking of some questions, I can tell you a bit more about the international standard. This was developed over a period of 3 years by representatives from 25 different countries. And I'm pleased I wasn't part of that process because I don't like committee work. But I am now on the technical committee that's looking at the metrics in the standard going forward to revise and improve and amend them. The areas, the core areas of the standard, ISO 30414, it's all about HR reporting. And there's 11 core areas, all those things which we've been doing in HR for years, like leadership and health and safety and diversity and succession planning and recruitment and so on. So there's 11 areas, nothing new. But what is new are the 60 metrics that underpin these, things that we can use to measure HR. We can establish the ROI of HR for the first time. I was talking to a finance director recently, and she said to me, David, we've wanted this for years. I said, well, it's not finance, it's HR. She said, yes, I know. Because on the profit and loss account, on the balance sheet, there's a big black hole called human capital. But what we can do now is to measure it and put value against it so that we can now see the contribution of HR to the organization. The second thing that's applicable here is because it's international and objective and robust, It's applicable across the piece, whether you're public sector, government, private sector corporation, even large NGOs and charities, it's applicable. I was talking with a gentleman the other day from Oman in the Middle East, and he liked what I was saying, because I've got partners and I've got contacts in Africa, in North America and Europe, and in the Indian subcontinent. And this gentleman was asking me about maybe the Middle East, and he was liking what I was saying. But inevitably, we got to the point when he said, you don't understand. You don't understand my country. You don't understand the mindset in the Middle East. I said, you're right. I don't. Absolutely. But this standard is bigger than Oman. It's bigger than the Middle East. It's even bigger than the United States of America. And at that point, he got it. Because now we can benchmark within an organization, between organizations, within an industry. We can even benchmark across sectors and across countries, because it's a standard set of metrics. And so it's applicable to every organization. Now, in America, some of our participants would have heard there's been big changes, because the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission in America, the stock market, if you will, has changed the regulations so that every organization in America now must disclose publicly, mandatory, compulsory, must disclose about their employees. And they're running scared. They don't know what to do, because it's hit the ground now, Q4. Whereas ISO 30414 provides a framework, provides the metrics. Now we can actually decide what to show. Now, there are two very important elements to these disclosures. Firstly, is to do with its principles led. And the chairman of the SEC has said, I want you to have quantitative and qualitative metrics. And I want you to have the same metrics quarter on quarter and year on year. And those metrics must be based on principles. What would you normally expect to report on within an organization? What would your heads of department, your VPs, normally expect to provide? Which is great, because they haven't said it must be about this and this and this and this, because then it would become a box ticking exercise. The second important element was what's called materiality. And what that means is, what would a normal investor expect to know about the organization, an individual or an institution? Before they put their money into the organization and buy shares, what would they expect to know about the employees? Obvious things like recruitment, development, retention, accidents, sickness, and so on. But the framework that we have covers all of that. Let me give you an example. Let's say there was an organization with 10 heads of department, vice presidents, and those 10 people are due to retire in the next 5 years. That kind of information is crucial for an investor. And so what this framework does, it helps internal requirements and external requirements. There are many stakeholders who will benefit from this.
Fantastic. I think, it's good information to know that there's now a standard that we can all use, and know that, it's not just something that, would be used in the UK or in the US, but something that we can all benchmark. In terms of advice for Africa, because not only do we have challenges in terms of being at the table as an L&D, as an HR function, being in the boardroom, in terms of using data and analytics to be able to then find our place on that boardroom table, what would your advice be, number one, in terms of how do we then change the conversation in the boardrooms, in organizations, to be able to say, look, we do have an international standard now. We're not giving you data from the air or giving you data that we think you will use, but data that is coming from an ISO standard. How do we start having those conversations? And number two,
I think you're right. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's two things I would say. Firstly, those of us who worked in HR can now start to begin to talk with the same language as those in the boardroom. And we can become business focused, because HR has been for too long seen as a service function. And I want to move it to be a strategic function. So we need to have a business mindset. The other thing that I would say specifically about Africa, and I really don't want to offend anybody, but we are talking about ethics and compliance and due diligence, because governance is essential. And one of the key core areas is all about ethics and compliance. From the micro level, which is to do with disciplinaries and grievance, to the macro level, where we're talking about money laundering and bribery. And I think that what this does is to say, look, this is time to grow up. We're on the world stage, and it doesn't matter whether you're in telecoms or pharmaceuticals. Recently, I had an interest shown to me from a very large oil and gas provider in Ghana. So it's across the whole piece. And multinationals are used to dealing appropriately. And what standards do is to raise everybody's standards to an acceptable level, so that we're all in the same position. And I was talking with Amazon recently, and I was saying about the standard, and they said, yes, but we've got that covered internally. We've got our own audit function. I said, yes, I'm sure you have, and that's fantastic. Internal audit is very important. But with respect, in their finance department, if they only audited their finance internally, many regulators and governments would throw up their hands in horror. It has to be regulated, it has to be examined, it has to be audited externally. I don't know who their auditors are. It's probably PricewaterhouseCoopers or Deloitte or Ernst & Young or whoever it happens to be. But it's the same with standards in HR. Internal audit is important, but not sufficient. We need external audits in order to see whether they meet the standard.
I like that you've mentioned ethics. We had a session around ethics within HR, which is within the HR space earlier in the day, and our speaker was very passionate about us having to change ethically straight from how we raise our children, because then if they get to a certain level and ethics is not part of their top of mind, then we'll never get anything done. So I like that you mentioned that. I think my next question then to you would be around let me see, I have a question here around then, if we have that issue in terms of ethics, and we have, of course, many other issues in terms of getting to where we are saying all our HR functions operate as they should, what advice would you give to Africa in terms of how do we get there? How do we get to be able to meet those standards, to be able to even standardize, not just in one country or one industry, but across Africa? How do we get there? And I think for me, and I would agree with Martin when he says this is a new beginning. This conference that we're having is not the only one we're going to have. We're going to have many, and we need to be able to see whether it's annual or biannual. We need to be able to see that things are beginning to change. So what would your advice to Africa be?
I think my advice to Africa will be the same as my advice everywhere else. It's still the same. HR now has to step up to the plate. And instead of waiting for change to happen, we need to make the change happen. We need to decide that going forward, we cannot go back to where we've come from. We have to make the change. As organizations adopt this new standard, so HR will change. Its position will change, its reputation will change, its function and role will change. Because we have to start speaking in the same language as the business. It doesn't matter whether it's private, public, or voluntary sector, because it's all about people. In the end, it's about people. It's not about productivity. or profitability. It's about effectiveness. Too long we've been speaking about efficiency, and that's all about resources. That's about more for less. How can we make people work harder? To be honest, I think that's old language now. We need to look to the future. And what this particular standard does, it embraces some other drivers that have been around for a few years. One of them is called the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line, it talks about profit, and we do need profit in order to sustain the organization, but it also talks about people, human capital. And the third part of the triple bottom line, we've got profit and people, and third one is planet. And I think Africa particularly, and many developing nations, have embraced the environmental agenda more quickly than those of us in the West and the developed nations. Alongside this, there's another driver, and that's called, it's a financial driver called integrated reporting. The integrated reporting network and framework has been driven by our financial colleagues, and they have a fantastic framework, a model which talks about all the capitals like financial capital, manufacturing, intellectual and social capital, but also human capital as an input. And then the organization develops through their normal functions, whatever they're doing, and then you have outcomes and outputs, and each of those capitals will be improved. It's about value added. The third main driver is that the United Nations have developed 17 sustainable development goals. The sustainability development goals of the United Nations are particularly appropriate to Africa and other developing areas. And these will embrace many issues and many areas like health and education and entrepreneurship and micro enterprise and so on and so on. My particular company will be donating 10% of our net profit to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals in Africa and elsewhere. But it's not just Africa, you see, because what I have been involved in a number of poor countries. I was in Kenya 18 months ago in Nairobi, and I went to one of the largest urban slums in the world, Kibera. And what we were doing there was not to give aid, because I feel strongly it's not about giving aid, it's helping people to help themselves. One of my passions is to enable other people to fulfill their potential. And we were doing some work there in a number of different areas, including microloans, including feeding programs, and to do with women's health and health education for women and young girls. I've also been involved in Romania, and Romania is in many ways poorer than some African nations. Their whole mindset is very ancient. It's still an agricultural economy. But what we're doing there is to help them to help themselves through vocational education and training. And so it's not just Africa, it is to do with mindsets. And what HR can do is to change the mindset from within the organization, so that we need to change the future. We cannot change the past. We can't go back. I don't think any organization wants to go back. It's about changing tomorrow. And this is where HR has a huge part to play.
Okay, I think that's a big one. Interesting you say you were in Kibera. I was there over the weekend as well. And it's I like what you say about empowering people and changing the mindsets of people through HR.
Yeah.
I keep asking myself, sitting in the HR function, that if I was to convince the board of directors or your exco that we need to do 1, 2, 3 things to adopt these standards, where would I begin?
First of all, there has to be commitment from the top. If it's driven by people at the bottom or even driven by HR, it will not ultimately succeed. There have to be champions, there has to be allies, there has to be commitment from the top. People are going to say, right, we're going to stop talking about it, and now we're really going to invest in our people. Those of us in HR for many years have heard the cliche about the people being our greatest asset. Well, really? Seriously? If they say that, I said, okay, if that's an asset, what's the return on that asset? We now have to change the mindset. We have to change the discourse. And we have to start, those of us in HR have to start talking business language in order that we can get acceptance by the board that they will start champion the needs of the human resources, the people. Because the only way to drive the organization forward, as I said earlier, is through technology and people. I would encourage any participant who wants to find out more about this to go onto our website, hcmmetrics.co.uk, send me an email and we can have a discussion. But to answer your question specifically, what should organizations be doing? And I think that's about putting people front and central, rather than treating them as something that can be got rid of. Too many organizations during the COVID-19 pandemic have said, right, we need to shut this down. We need to get rid of 30% of the people. Well, to be frank, which 30%? And why did you get rid of that 30% and not the other 30%? Why not 29%? And have many people been lost who they now regret having lost? What this framework will do is to actually decide the future. It's called scenario planning. It's called contingency planning. And whilst we know that there will be another pandemic, there will be an oil spillage, there'll be a crash on a currency, we don't know when or which, but what this framework does, ISO 30414, it gives HR the means to predict the future and to plan for it, so that whatever happens in the future, we can make informed decisions. When you go to a hospital and the doctor says you need an operation, and you say, well, okay, let's talk about it, and they convince you you need an operation, they then provide you with something you have to sign. It's called informed consent. And that's what this is. It's about giving informed consent about decisions for the future. Our colleagues in finance have management accounts. It's exactly the same thing. It's giving information and data and evidence to the managers so they can make informed decisions about strategy going forward. And that's what we're now offering for the whole of the HR function.
What I seem to be hearing over and over again is that we are going to be telling the same story around putting people front and central. Difference is now we will have the numbers to show for it. We will be speaking the same language as EXCO, which is very exciting because this empowers your HR director, it empowers your HR business partners, it empowers your learning and development specialists to be able to go in and say, look, we have this program, it's people oriented, but here are the numbers. This is what you expect to get out of it. My experience in L&D takes me back to ask the question then, how then will I be able, so maybe I don't know how to coin this, but if I and I'm yet to see the standard, will the standard be able to show me as an L&D practitioner that if I adopt this program, or if I go ahead and decide to have a conversation with EXCO around a particular change that we want to make, it will help me be able to get data that will be convincing enough to tell them the same story, only with numbers?
Definitely, absolutely. And now we don't just have to do it retrospectively. We don't have to. We can predict. I've been doing this for years, and I was working with a master's level student in a company called Bloomberg, which is a big financial resources outfit. And many people will know that in L&D particularly, we have reported what's happened, and we've said how good it is and how applicable it is, and what the return on investment was, and so on and so on in the past. Even, and I'm trying to remember when it was, and I'm sure it was about 15 years ago now. We were able to predict then how to make L&D profitable, predictable, return on investment in the future. And I did this with a master level student in Bloomberg on an international leadership development program. When designing programs in L&D, we have a variety of different methods and means and approaches which we can select from. But what we did, we deliberately chose various elements at the design stage to decide the outcomes, even before we'd had the course. And then later on, we went back and said, we proved it. So this has been applicable to L&D in ways that hasn't been applicable to HRM for many years. So it is doable, but we just have to change our mindset. We have to say, well, this isn't a cost function or a cost center. This is a profit center. This is a contribution center. When I was head of L&D for one presentation, I had discussions with the chief exec, and he said, David, from now on, you're going to be a profit center. Well, that was a big challenge to my mindset. But I thought, right, okay. And in addition to improving the performance of the existing staff, what we did was we had spare capacity. And we used that spare capacity to make it available to external agencies and organizations who came and used our facilities, came and used our trainers, came and used our courses. And we contributed then to the organization. It's just changing the mindset, moving away from service to strategy.
I think I like that. I think I like the fact that HR can actually be a profit center, because when you think of HR and people, it's always, the thought is always around you're a cost, you're spending money and we're not seeing what we're getting from that expenditure. So I like that we can actually shift from HR teams or HR departments being cost centers to turning into profit centers. I think for me, this has been a very exciting session, and I would really like to thank you for those insights. I'm sure many of us who had no idea or did not know the detail of the ISO standard for HR are very excited to have learned this. So I'd like to say a big thank you. I don't see like I have any other questions from the panel, from the audience. So I'd like to really thank you for your time. And maybe you can share with us that email, because I'm sure I will be making use of that email.
That's very kind of you. I've really, thank you, Siri. I really enjoyed this opportunity to speak to you and to tell people about this new standard, ISO 30414. And our website is hcmmetrics.co.uk. And the email address is david.simmons at hcmmetrics.co.uk. We also have I have a personal LinkedIn page, and our company has a LinkedIn page as well. But if you go to our website, hcmmetrics.co.uk, have a good look around there and get in contact. I probably have 4 or 5 meetings a day at the moment, a third of which are international, and I'd love to talk to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm sure many, many questions and conversations will come out of this particular session. So again, I'd like to thank you. I will share that email or in the lounge for people to make use, and the website as well. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, and thank you.
Syria, thank you so much. I've enjoyed this. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye. Me as well. Bye-bye.